Hello and welcome back to week number 8 of our Applied Food Science course. Hope you're hungry, because today we're going to plant a seed of knowledge, because we're talking all about plants. What are they? Why do we eat them? Why are they so important in the culinary world? Well, the first answer to that is super easy. Plants are mega crazy healthy for us. Right? Whenever you think of, someone who eats really healthy, it's always they have a diet that's very high in fruits and vegetables. For the longest time in America, since about the 60s, there was a movement that kind of pushed meat and dairy as our healthy foods, grains as well. And the main reason for that was that the meat and dairy industries, and also the grains like corn and wheat, they had a lot of money, and they would push Congress and other lawmaking bodies to make rules and laws that kind of pushed towards the meats and dairy side of things, and even grains. And one of the big reasons for that is because for the longest time in our history, humans have strived for an adequate diet. And the idea behind an adequate diet is simply a diet that fulfills all of your basic nutritional needs, so that you are alive and you don't die of malnourishment. And meats and cheese and grain are really good for that because they're very high in carbohydrates and fats and protein that really keep us going. But now that we're in an age where those things are all readily available, the question is now shifting from, well, what's an adequate diet to what's an optimal diet? That is to say, what diet can make us the healthiest, live for the longest, experience the fewest negative health side effects? And as it turns out, the answer to most of that are plants. So let's talk about plants. Why are they so good for us? Well, the thing that plants have, and we broadly classify it, is these things that we call phytochemicals. Now, what a weird term, phytochemicals. Well, let's think about it for a second. Phyto is just a old word prefix that just means plant, and chemicals means chemicals. So they're anything that comes from a plant that is generated in a plant. Things like vitamin C and beta carotene, even antioxidants that can be really good for you. And there's so many of them. In fact, if you eat a non-plant food that is said to be high in vitamins or minerals, it's probably because that animal ate a lot of plants that had that chemical and just kind of absorbed it as it went. That's why, for example, liver is so high in vitamin A, because when we eat plants that have beta carotene, which is kind of the precursor, the before chemical to vitamin A, it gets processed in the liver, and so that's where all that vitamin A is stored. Okay, so all of the vitamins and minerals that we get in our diet come from plants, because plants take them out of the ground and they synthesize them. It's really good. So what sort of health benefits are we talking about? Well, there's a whole list of phytochemicals that goes for miles, and you can see some of them in your book. But some of the big ones, they're great for our eyes, specifically the development of them and the maintenance to make sure they're staying good. Now, side note, if you've ever heard that carrots are good for your eyes, actually not so true. That was actually propaganda spread by the British during World War II because they had invented radar and they didn't want the Germans to know how they could see their planes at night. And so they were like, oh yeah, we just eat a lot of carrots and now we can see them really good. Turns out, not so much. Not a true fact. Anyway, moving on, they're also really good for your blood lipid level. Remember we talked about cholesterol a few lectures ago? And how if you get that HDL, it's not so great in your blood. A lot of phytochemicals actually work to prevent that from ever entering your blood in the first place, and then regulate the levels of it as you go on. On top of that, there have been many studies and pieces of evidence that say plant phytochemicals can really protect your DNA. which can cause things like cancer and other diseases. Also, really good for keeping calcium in your bones. Your body's constantly breaking down and building back up your bones, but sometimes if you get out of whack, it can take away more bone than it puts back, and that's bad. Plants can help with that. And finally, it can help with even things like bacteria, both making sure you've got good bacteria in your gut, and also making sure your body can get rid of bacterial infections even faster. All around, fantastic for you. Okay, so let's talk about a few specific health benefits that you've probably heard about. First, antioxidants. What the heck is an antioxidant? Well, as you may have guessed, it actually has something to do with oxygen. Okay, antioxidant. Well, here's the problem. When we consume food and we turn it into energy, the energy that's in there has a lot stored in a very small package, okay? In all our cells, there's this molecule called ATP. Don't need to worry about it, but just that's what it's stored in. And this has so much energy that it can cause things to happen in our cells that wouldn't normally occur, which is good, right? That allows you to actually move against the force of gravity. You shouldn't be able to do that, but you can because of ATP. But now, because there's so much energy, you can generate these things called free radicals, which are very high energy particles. And basically, if you've got free radicals, they're prone to react with anything around them. And that's not so good. Our cells are in a very finely tuned balance, and you don't want these free radicals running around messing stuff up with other things. So antioxidants basically they quench the free radicals. They remove them. They react with the free radical in a harmless way that keeps your DNA or other cell structures from getting damaged. Awesome. What else do plants have? Fiber. You've probably heard about fiber like crazy, and fiber is one of the most important health aspects that I think is currently just blatantly ignored in much of American eating habits. If there's one thing that you should try to change your diet towards, if you're trying to eat healthy, it should be consuming more fiber. Why? Well, here's the thing. In most American diets, and we've talked about this, especially in bonus bits, we consume these simple carbohydrates, that is to say, simple sugars, and your body processes them really fast. Now, simple sugars, simple carbohydrates are most readily available of almost any other staple food molecule because they're so cheap in things like processed bread, or if you go to McDonald's or Burger King, it's mostly simple carbohydrates. Well, the thing with fiber, or I should back up, even in things like apples or bananas, a lot of these sugars, the carbohydrates in here, are simple sugars, meaning your body would process them really fast. But here's the thing. If you've got this apple here, there's a lot of fiber in the skin. And we'll talk about kind of how you can recognize that in a little bit. But essentially what fiber does is it slows down your digestion. It does that by kind of clogging things up. Fiber is a very long, tendrily molecule, and it kind of looks like this cord here. So you've got like a main piece going down the middle, and then you've got all these little tendrils coming off of it. And what happens is these tendrils will grab onto that sugar and make it more difficult for your body to process. And while that might sound bad, let's think about it. Your body can only absorb and process sugar at a certain rate. And so by making it more difficult, you're actually slowing down the rate that you absorb that sugar, and it's going to be way better for you in the long haul. Lower insulin spikes and a whole slew of other benefits. The other great thing about these long tendrils is that they tend to grab on to nasty things like toxins and bacteria that are not so good for you, and they will actually take them out with the trash, so to speak. So that's why fiber is so great. It's so good for you, is because it can actually have an effect on the other things that you eat. It can make it better for your body. Fiber is awesome. Now, moving on. So if you want a fruit or vegetable with all of these things, it turns out all fruits and vegetables were not created equally. The main way, and this is just kind of a general rule of thumb, it's not perfect, but far and away, the darker a food is, the more helpful phytochemicals will be in it. For example, red grapes have shown much higher ability to, or much higher content of good phytochemicals and fiber and things like that than green grapes. And the reason we can talk about color as a being in relation to health benefits is that basically the darker the color, that means the more stuff there is in there. And the more stuff that there is in there, the better for us, right? Now, the last thing that we should consider, though, is that not all phytochemicals are these wildly health beneficial things. There are toxins, and I use toxin as a general term for chemicals that will do bad stuff to us if you consume too much of them. And I do want to emphasize that last part, too much. A lot of toxins actually can provide really nice flavors and really enhance the cooking of a lot of foods. One of the most famous are the toxins, if you will, in onions, right? Onions have a very sulfurous component to them, and when you cut the onion, you release an enzyme that will basically break down that sulfur compound into a whole bunch of nasty stuff that gets in your eyes and makes you cry and feel bad and stuff. And that's good for an onion, because we have to remember, plants don't move around a whole lot. So they have to have ways to keep predators and other things that would eat them away, unless they're meant to be eaten. And we'll talk about that in a second. But things like onions that grow underground, and these store a lot of the energy for the onion plant. They need these toxic defense mechanisms to keep from being eaten to extinction. Okay. Now, humans, luckily, with the advent of cooking, for example, we can nullify a lot of those toxins simply through heat and other preparations to make these things absolutely delicious and really dig into that energy store that's in them. Okay. Now, one toxin I did want to talk about specifically is the tannin. Now, if you've ever had a glass of red wine and you drink it and you get that kind of dry feeling to your mouth, or if you've ever had an apple and you take a bite and you swallow it, and even though it's super juicy, your mouth feels really kind of dry on the inside, that quality is from tannins. And they're a very interesting phytochemical that have been said to have really nice antioxidant benefits. But what I find interesting is there is a term for this mouthfeel called astringency. So go impress your friends the next time you have a nice apple or a cup of red wine that leaves your mouth a little dry by saying, the astringency, it's good. Anyway, moving on. So we've talked about kind of these health benefits. Well, what exactly is going on inside of a plant? Well, it turns out plants are a whole lot different than us. All the way down to the cell level. Now remember, cells, because it's been a while since we've talked about them. Cells are the basic building blocks of life. Everything that is alive, you and me and plants and the dog and chickens are made of cells. And cells are their own little individual pieces, and they have stuff inside them. Now let's look at a plant cell. This beautifully created diagram, because there are a few things that, if you know anything about animal cells, should be very strikingly different. If you don't know, let me point them out. So let's start off with this bad boy, the cell wall. What is that about? Well, let's think about a cell for a second. Our cells are kind of like this balloon, except there's a lot of stuff inside of them. But the main thing I want to focus on is that this balloon, it holds its shape very well, but it can move, it can kind of go from side to side, you can poke it, and it's flexible. And that's good if you move, because as something that moves, you don't want to be too rigid, right? You want to be very kind of loosey-goosey, able to go along. Can you imagine if you were just a firm, rigid structure, right? You wouldn't be able to move. That's not good. But plants, they don't move, okay? It's one of the trade-offs for some of the benefits that they have. But in order to protect that, they do have a cell wall, but they have an additional layer of protection called, or sorry, they do have a cell membrane. Their additional layer of protection is the cell wall. Now notice there is still a cell membrane inside the cell wall, but now they've got this hard outer coating, which surprisingly is made of fiber. And this hard outer coating does two things for it. First, it provides structure and protection for this cell. So that's why plants stand straight up and they don't just kind of bend over at the waist, so to speak. But the other thing that this does has to do with another one of the plant's differences, and that's this big old bad boy, the vacuole. So plants have this organelle, is what this is called the vacuole, and it takes up the most space in most plant cells. And the vacuole is just filled with water or other storage molecules. The idea is plants don't move around a lot. And so they need a place to store the stuff that they have. Now, the other function of the cell wall is the vacuole changes size a lot. If it's got lots of stuff, if it's springtime and it's getting all this nice new water and sunlight, it's going to be huge, right? It's going to fill up most of the cell. But as the year goes on and that vacuole starts to shrink, it wouldn't be so good if the whole plant started to shrink and it'd fall over. So what the cell wall does is it keeps that plant structure even when the internal cell starts to shrink away, which is great. Side note, that is why if say you have something like celery, for example, and your celery starts to get a little limp, the reason is because that vacuole is actually shrinking. And while the cell wall is really good at maintaining most of the structure, it'll still start to get a little limp there. You can re-crisp up your celery, so to speak, by just putting it in some water for a while, because then the vacuole will be able to absorb more water and get that structure that we like so much. Okay, so the final little thing we have here are these bad boys, chloroplasts. Now, chloroplasts are probably the most important defining feature of plants because they are what turns sunlight into their food. Now, plants don't have to eat. A lot of people think they take water from the soil as and vitamins and minerals, right? But actually, most of their food comes from sunlight, and actually taking that sunlight and using it to break apart carbon dioxide, which is a really great cycle because we breathe in oxygen and we exhale carbon dioxide. Plants essentially inhale carbon dioxide and they exhale or produce oxygen. So it's a really nice two-way street we've got going there. But we'll get to plant, or I guess let's talk about chlorophyll. So the thing about chlorophyll is there's a bunch of different colors of it, and it's usually what gives specifically plant leaves their color. Most of them are green. What that means is that actually the chlorophyll is absorbing every color of light except for green. It's shooting that back at you so you can see it. Don't worry about that detail. The important thing is plants are green because they have chlorophyll, and that's how they absorb the light that's going on in there. Cool. So now that we've talked about the plant cell, one last thing. I wanted to go back to the cell wall because there is something interesting about this. The cell walls have fiber. We said that they were made of fiber, specifically a fiber called cellulose. which is what makes all plant cell walls. And this fiber is really interesting in that it can come in a lot of different varieties. Specifically, let's look at a banana. The outside of this banana has a different, longer kind of cellulose that's a lot more fibrous than if we opened this up and you've got this really soft inner flesh. Now, they both have cell walls and they both have fiber, but this fiber is a lot shorter than the fiber that's in these cell walls. And what that means is that if you try to take a bite or to peel, it's not going to come off real good because you've got these long fibers you're trying to bite through. Now, the inner cell walls, or the cell walls of the inner cells, if you try to take a bite of these, because they're so short, that was a good banana, you can just bite right through them. You don't have to break them as much. And that's usually what defines the outer fruit from the, or the peel from the inner of a fruit specifically. Now, the point I wanted to make though is fiber has that kind of stringy quality to it. So in any fruit or vegetable, you're usually going to have some part of it that is especially stringy, whether it's the peel or the inside, or in the case of celery, kind of the whole thing. That comes from the fiber that's in the cell walls. It's the fiber in the cell wall that gives plants their texture. Okay? All right, moving on. Okay, so we talked about the cells. Now, when it comes to the chlorophyll, the thing about the chlorophyll and the color of plants in general is that usually they have very distinct colors to them, right? Vegetables are a rainbow of colors, and sometimes it's due to chlorophyll, sometimes it's due to other chemicals. But here's one thing they all have in common, is that most of them are sensitive to enzymes in the world, especially or even in their own cells. And the idea is once the cells are damaged, they keep these enzymes and they keep their color molecules separate. But when the cells are damaged, the enzymes will interact with the color molecules and they will turn them gross brown colors, almost universally in all of fruits. If you've ever dropped a fruit and it's turned brown, or a vegetable and it's turned brown, it's because you broke the cells and you let the enzymes in one part interact with the color molecules in another part, and then you've got brown. That's no good. How do you avoid that? Okay, because you might say, oh, I'll be very careful with my fruits and vegetables. Well, consider, you're probably going to be cutting these things up. You're going to be mashing them. You're going to be manipulating them in some way. To think that you're not going to damage them is just insane. So how do we minimize that? Well, there's really two or three methods to this. Okay, the first is inactivating the enzyme, and you can do that with acid. Okay, a lot of, if you cut up really any fruit or vegetable and you leave it out for any amount of time, it's going to start to brown. One of the best ways to nullify that is just a little sprinkle of lemon juice all across it. Now, the other thing we can do is keep it cold. It turns out these enzymes work very poorly at cold temperatures. So after you cut up something, if you want to keep it for a while, stick it in the fridge. It'll stay, it'll brown a little bit, but less so. Or you can heat it up. Because, as we've talked about, when you heat things, the enzymes in them tend to denature that. That is to say, stop working. And so that's why a quick blanch, that is to say, you boil something for maybe anywhere from 5 seconds to a minute, and then immediately put it back on cold water to stop the cooking, because that'll be long enough to denature the enzymes, but it will not be long enough to damage the color or pigment molecules. That's a great way to keep that color. Now, the final way is air, because it turns out that most of these reactions only happen in the presence of air. So if you're going to store something for a while in the fridge, make sure it's in an airtight container. That'll help minimize the browning, not eliminate it completely, but make it less than it usually is. So, moving on. We talked about the cells. What else? So, in the realm of biology, we start with individual cells. And then if we've got a group of cells that are similar to each other, we call them tissue. Now, it turns out plants have generally three types of tissue. First, they have ground tissue. Now, ground tissue is usually pretty much most of the plant that you see. For example, this banana, every cell in here, most of them we consider ground tissue, okay? It's the bulk of the plant. Now, the other part, one of the other tissues is dermal tissue. Now, if you may associate dermal with skin, and you'd be right. Dermal tissue is a reference to the outer layer of cells on the plant that's usually a lot thicker, has a lot more longer cellulose, a lot longer fiber molecules in their cell walls. Okay, so that's the bark of a tree, or the peel on this apple, or the skin on these grapes is dermal tissue. Now, the final type is what we call vascular tissue. And vascular tissue is essentially, because plants stay in one place, they need to be able to move molecules very efficiently from, say, their roots to their leaves, and vice versa. And the vascular tissue are the little tubes that this stuff goes through, traditionally called the xylem and the phloem. Now, you don't need to know that, it's just cool words. So we have the ground tissue, right, which is most of this. You have the dermal tissue, which is the outside. And then even in this banana, down the middle, you can sometimes see these little crevices and cracks that go go long ways down it. That is the vascular tissue, allowing, say, bananas are very sweet, so they've got a lot of sugar. So all those sugar from the leaves all the way down through the banana. So, bigger than tissue. You start taking tissues, you put them together, we get what we call organs. Now you may be thinking, plants don't have organs. Well, organs is kind of a loose term just for a structure that does one job. And plants have 6 structures that we classify as organs, okay? And you're probably familiar with most of them. So if we start at the bottom of a plant, right? Like if we started at the bottom of this flower here, down in the ground we have the roots. Now the roots are responsible for 2 things. 1, they absorb water and transport it to the rest of the plant. And 2, they keep the plant firmly planted wherever it is. They provide that structure. Now, examples of edible roots, carrots, turnips, parsnips, okay? Now, moving up from the root, we have the stem. Now, again, back to the flowers, right? The stem is kind of this featureless thing that goes from the roots to the rest of the plant. Now, it turns out we eat a lot of stems, a lot more than a lot of people think, because while you may be able to list some common ones like celery, it turns out that plants really like to store like sugars and other good chemicals at the tips of their stems rather than in their roots. Usually they use their roots to kind of branch out and provide structure, and then they'll actually store most of their stuff in the stems. So most people think potatoes, for example, are a root. They are not. They're actually considered a tuber, which is explicitly a swollen stem end. So the roots come out of the potato, not they are the potato. The potato is actually the end of the stem. And that goes for other things like sweet potatoes. Now, moving on up from that, we have the final common, or one of the common, every plant has these, right? Every plant has all of these things. We've got the leaves. Now, leaves are super crazy important because that's what absorbs all the sunlight, okay? The leaves are what is doing the absorbing. So without leaves, your plant is not going to exist. Now, common leaves that we eat, of course, there's spinach, kale, lettuce, leafy greens are all leaves. Even things like cilantro and basil that have those huge flavors are leaves, okay? Now, apart from leaves, we have the flower. Now, the flower is the sexual reproduction organ of the plant. And now, we don't eat as many flowers as the rest of these, but some common ones, cauliflower or broccoli, those little florets are actually the flowers of those plants. And finally, we have the fruit. Once a flower is pollinated, either by itself or by a bee, what'll happen is the ovum, which is right at the base of the flower, so if you can see in there, right there, that will actually start to swell and grow, very much like a pregnant woman, right? Think of the pregnant woman as the fruit and the baby is the seed, right? Because all fruits have seeds inside of them, or all naturally occurring fruits have seeds inside of them, right? There's been great strides in genetic engineering that give us things like cherries without the pits or watermelons without their seeds, which is great for us to eat, bad for them to reproduce. So we've got the fruit as our final one, and you guys know what fruits are, okay? Now, one important distinction to make here is that fruits are in reference to a specific organ of the plant. That is to say, when a flower gets pollinated, it will eventually turn into a fruit. Now, vegetables are in reference to every other organ on the plant. So, leaves and flowers and stems and roots, if it comes from any of those, it's a vegetable. This is why there's been that age-old debate of tomatoes, fruit or vegetable. They're a fruit. They are because they come from a flower that's been pollinated and then grows to have a, fruit with seeds inside. Tomatoes are a fruit. End of discussion. So, that's your intro to plants. Now, over the next 2 weeks, we're actually going to be breaking fruits and vegetables kind of apart and dissecting them, looking at very specific examples of each, cooking techniques, things like that. So, hope you enjoyed. Keep your eye out for the bonus bit where you'll hear about your lab. Thanks for watching.